Mr. Hatch.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President,
Senator from Utah.
I want to compliment the distinguished senator from West Virginia for playing a very, very important pivotal role here in helping to bring about some changes in this bill that I think are going to make the difference between whether we pass a bipartisan bill that will do a lot against crime or not. And so I ask unanimous consent that I withdraw the original Hatch amendment with all of the appendages there too.
The senator has that right. The amendment.
And I withdraw the amendment. Mr. President, I yield to the distinguished senator from West Virginia.
Mr. President, I thank the distinguished senator from Utah, Mr. Hatch. I shall shortly send to the desk a modification of my amendment. Now, when Mr. Hatch withdrew his amendment, by virtue of my amendments being a second-degree amendment to his amendment, my amendment also went away. Am I correct?
Secretary is correct.
I thank the chair. So I will shortly send to the desk a modification of my amendment. And I'm pleased to report that we have worked out an agreement which will significantly increase our efforts in fighting violent crime throughout America. In addition to accommodating all of the programs authorized in the underlying bill, the modification also accommodates the regional prisons proposal contained in Senator Hatch's underlying amendment, which was originally the underlying amendment, as well as increases for programs of particular interest to Senator Graham of Texas. The modified amendment now before the Senate provides for the transfer of $22.268 billion to the Violent Crime Reduction Trust Fund. These resources are made possible by the estimated savings calculated by the Congressional Budget Office from fully implementing the reductions in federal employment contemplated in the National Performance Review. These personnel reductions are included in the amendment for each of the fiscal years 1994, 1998 inclusive. Additionally, the amendment makes the necessary adjustments to discretionary spending caps for fiscal years 1994, 1998 inclusive. I will now briefly explain the funding of changes made in the modified amendment. Like my previous amendment, this modification provides $12.276 billion to fully fund the underlying bill S-1607. In addition, the modification includes $3.720 billion to provide an additional 40,000 state and local law enforcement personnel. When added to the 60,000 similar positions provided in the underlying bill, this brings the total number of new police officers on the streets of our nation to 100,000. An additional $3 billion has been added for the construction and operation of regional prisons. This is the same amount that was contained in the underlying amendment by Senator Hatch and was included at the request of both Senator Hatch and Senator Graham. Another $1 billion has been added for the construction of jails, boot camps, and other minimum security state and local facilities. Well, it will be, and I'll add in a moment. $500 million has been added for the construction and operation of secure facilities to house violent juveniles. These facilities are critically needed to remove some 60,000 violent, gun-wielding, repeat juvenile offenders from our streets. And finally, $600 million is included to fund Violence Against Women Act, the Violence Against Women Act, to combat domestic violence. Now, Mr. President, let me just take a moment here, or how long is a moment? It can be any length of time. I'll take a few minutes to explain how we got where we are. After offering the amendment in the second degree to the amendment by Mr. Hatch today, I listened to Mr. Graham of Texas make a speech in which he recommended that we should build additional prisons, and he suggested the figure of $6 billion, into which we would put incarcerated individuals. And he also recommended a mandatory minimum sentence. And I thought that was a good idea. I think they ought to be incarcerated. And I think we ought to throw the key away, at least until they've served the, I believe it's 80% or 85%. And we ought to have prisons in which to put these individuals. So I came to the floor, and I wanted to tell Mr. Graham that I felt as he did. And I did. Called him in his office, told him I felt the same way. But I said, I want to talk to Senator Biden. He's the manager of the bill. I don't want to undermine him. I want to see how he feels about it. I talked to Senator Biden. He said, well, I would like to see the full funding for 100,000 policemen. 60,000, we've provided for 60,000 in the bill. I'd like the 100,000. I said, well, let's just do both. And from there, we went to where we are now. And there were long discussions with Senator Hatch, Senator Biden, Senator Graham, and with, I think, mainly among those three. Therefore, we've arrived at the amendment which I'm now about to offer, and I offer it on behalf of myself, Mr. Mitchell, the Majority Leader, Mr. Dole, the Minority Leader, Mr. Biden, the Chairman of the Judiciary Committee and Manager of the bill, Mr. Hatch, the Ranking Manager of the bill, Mr. Sasser, Mr. Graham, Mr. Curry, Mr. Dodd, Mr. Mack. And we certainly will appreciate the co-sponsorship of any other senators, and I ask unanimous consent that any other senators who may wish to add their name may do so.
Without objection, so ordered.
Now, did I get everybody in there? Now, Mr. President, I thank my colleagues, and I particularly thank the manager of the bill, Mr. Biden, and I particularly thank Mr. Hatch, and I especially thank Mr. Graham for his suggestion, which brought me to the floor and which finally led to our being where we are at this point. And I want to thank Mr. Curry. Mr. Curry came to my office probably 10 days ago and told me how badly needed this legislation is and how badly we need the money. And I said to Mr. Curry, I agree with everything you say about the need for the legislation, but we don't have the money. there just isn't, we don't have that money. And explained our situation with respect to appropriations, the caps, and the freeze, and he understood. And then in the conference the other day, I made the same statement. I said that after Mr. Biden and Mr. Kerry had spoken, I said, this is all well and good. I agree with everything you said, but we don't have the money. And then Mr. Graham offered an amendment. 2 days ago, was it?
Yes, sir.
2 or 3 days ago. And I voted against his amendment. I voted against his amendment. But his amendment carried overwhelmingly. I didn't speak against it, but I voted against it. But his amendment carried overwhelmingly, so it made the money available. And this is an extremely serious problem. And it's crucial that we do the best we can do under the tight budgetary circumstances to deal with this problem. And so, having said that, I salute all those who work so hard, and I also compliment and thank our staffs for their work on the amendment. I urge my colleagues to support this modified amendment. I send it to the desk. And I ask unanimous consent that further reading of the amendment, that the reading of the amendment be dispensed with. And I also ask unanimous consent that no other amendments be in order to this amendment, and that no other amendments be in order until this amendment is disposed of.
Is there objection? Seeing none, so
Mr.
ordered.
President.
Senator from Texas.
Well, Mr. President, let me first say to the dear chairman of the Appropriations Committee that I have given many speeches on the floor of the Senate, some that I thought were pretty good, some that I thought were quite mediocre. But I don't know that I've ever given one that turned out to be more productive than the one today. It reminds me of the poem Elegy written in a country churchyard. It talks about the sexton ringing the bell, little thinking that the great Napoleon hears the bell and pauses and is refreshed by it. We have here a happy coincidence of events that I think is going to make American history on crime and punishment. 3 days ago, I offered an amendment that was aimed at trying to set a cap on federal employment and enforce the President's reinvention of government program. How the amendment works is it sets in law the goals of reduction in the size of the federal bureaucracy. It has an enforcement mechanism through the Office of Management and Budget with a freeze on federal hiring when we breach the gap. The Congressional Budget Office scored that amendment as saving $21.8 billion. That gave us the vehicle to fund this crime bill, not to promise money, but to actually provide that money. We have now put together a bill that is going to approach the crime problem in 2 ways. It's going to try to deal with the first offender. It's going to provide boot camps. It's going to try to provide drug rehabilitation. And it's also going to build prisons so that violent predator criminals end up serving their full term. I think this is a very important step. This is clearly going to be the most important crime bill that we have passed in my time in the Congress, and I believe it's going to be the most important crime bill that we have passed in many, many years. This is an important step forward because not only are we going to end up with minimum mandatory sentencing for people who commit terrible violent crimes, but we're going to provide the prisons to put them in. We're going to challenge the states to have honesty in sentencing, and as a result of this bill that we are going to pass in the Senate, I believe that we're going to take a gigantic step in taking violent criminals off the streets of America. And I believe that that is truly doing God's work and America's work at the same time. I want to thank the distinguished chairman of the Appropriations Committee for his leadership in making this happen, and I'm very proud to be a co-sponsor.
Mr. President, if I may just say one other thing. I should also say that Senator Sasser, the chairman of the Budget Committee, came to my office this morning, and we discussed this matter. He is very supportive of this modification, and I want to pay tribute to the work that he has done on this amendment and on the original amendment, which I had offered earlier on. I yield the floor.
Mr. President. Mr. President, I too want to compliment the chairman of the Appropriations Committee and the majority leader, and I don't often do this, and his staff, a fellow we affectionately refer to as Hilly around here, who quite frankly came up with this idea of how to deal with the efforts of that have been made by the senator from Texas, and prior to that by the administration about cutting federal employment, and in effect setting up this trust fund. Senator Hatch and I have been working on this bill for a long, long time, and let me just take 2 minutes to make several very brief points. Number one, the bill that all of this is being attached to is the bill that the President of the United States, through his Attorney General, and I worked out. And so the underlying bill here is the President's bill. But the ranking Republican, Senator Hatch, who made the point to me throughout that he thought that one of the major ingredients of the Republican position on crime was to deal more with doing more about prison construction and incarceration, and quite frankly from the states to have tougher standards and penalties. That was totally consistent with what my friend from Massachusetts has been saying. I must publicly acknowledge to him that he turned out to be right and I was wrong. He and I both wanted a $20+ billion bill. I was determined that I would not write a bill, have a name on it called the Biden bill, that I couldn't pay for. So I started off with a $5.9 billion bill several weeks ago, cutting back from a $9 billion bill I had last year. And my friend came to me and said, "Joe, what are you doing?" And I said, "We can't get any more money." And he made the point, if we hollered long enough, spoke long enough, made the case strong enough, we could change people's minds. I, quite frankly, was a bit cynical about the ability to do that. As of yesterday, I met with the President of the United States and his staff at length, as did the Senator from Massachusetts previously, and the President and his Chief of Staff and others agreed they would work to fund a $10 billion bill. So I reintroduced a new bill, a $10 billion bill. But my friend from Massachusetts kept saying, "No, we can do more." And then along came the man who seems to pull every chestnut out of the fire in this place whenever you want to get something done. I've known this for 20 years, but you want to get it done, go to the man who knows how to do it. The chairman of the Appropriations Committee, a man that I and all of us affectionately still refer to as leader. I once said to him, I'd almost rather him be leader again. He wasn't nearly as powerful when he was leader as he was as chairman of the Appropriations Committee. But the truth of the matter is, every time you want to get something done, if you get he and the majority leader together on something, we hardly ever fail. And so I went, along with others, to him the other day and said, "Help, boss. We need help on getting this done." I must tell you, this exceeds my expectations. I have been arguing and fighting for 100,000 police for a long time. There are some very, 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 very important pieces of this legislation that the senator from Utah has been pushing for a long time. And the senator from Utah and I have believed all along, and our staffs, that if we were left to our own devices, we could come up with a bill that everyone would be happy with. And so I just want to suggest that the combination of getting the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, the chairman of the Budget Committee, the ranking member of the Budget Committee, Senator Domenici, the leader of the majority leader, and with the unrelenting pushing, I say affectionately, of my friend from Massachusetts, that we have come up with what I can say without reservation, since every single major crime bill since 1974, I've either been the primary co-sponsor of and or the author of, I can say without hesitation, this is by far and away the most significant federal effort to deal with violent crime in America that has ever been undertaken in the United States Senate, ever. We are talking about something that is of major consequence. Now, let me say to my colleagues who are listening back in their offices and all wondering how long we're going to go tonight and what's going to happen here, and then I'll yield. I see my friend from New Mexico is seeking recognition. It is the intention of the chairman and the ranking member, the managers of this bill, once we pass this amendment, which I hope we will do shortly, that we will try very hard to discourage some of the amendments, because one of the things that our colleagues are going to find is much of what they have been asking for has been accommodated by this significant amendment. And I would also urge my colleagues who have amendments that they feel are not accommodated by this doubling of the size of the bill. I see my friend from North Dakota on the bill. He and Byron Dorgan, his colleague, have been pushing hard to deal with violent juveniles, have been pushing hard to deal with violent offenders in jail. This exceeds their wildest expectations, I think it is fair to say, and encompasses all they wanted. There are others on this floor who have been equally interested, and I think when they look at this, and I encourage their staffs to look very closely at what the chairman of the Appropriations Committee is sending up on behalf of all those that he named. And then, if you still think you need an amendment, please come forward. Now, I see my friend from California on the floor. She has a very important amendment that the President of the United States has, at her bidding, signed off on, which, after we finish this, we hope we can move to quickly. She will explain it, but it is a very significant amendment. Following on her, she came to the committee earlier, I might add, with an arson amendment that was her doing, her thinking, her idea, and I must publicly apologize to her, because in the meantime, another arson amendment was brought up. I quite frankly thought it was hers, which I quite frankly think is a little better than the one that we had. I know she joined in the one that we passed, but there are going to be amendments like the senator from California's amendment that are very important, that aren't encompassed within this arrangement. There are others of you who will have them. So I urge you, all of those of you and your staffs who are listening, to please come to the floor, because it's the intention of the ranking member, I think that's fair to say, and myself, to try very hard to negotiate those amendments that we can, to have votes on those that we can't, and to move this process along, because, as my mother would say, with the grace of God and the goodwill of the neighbors, we may be able to, in a relatively short time, present to the American people a bill that is the first step, but the most significant step, in dealing with violence in America. And I might add one last point. The senator from Utah and I have been working very hard for a long time on a thing called the Violence Against Women bill. It is of significant consequence. It was going to be the third item on the agenda of dealing with violence in this Senate over the next 3 months. We have incorporated that bill in this amendment and funded it as well within this amendment. And I want to pay a very high compliment to my friend from Utah, who, quite frankly, were he not insistent upon this taking place at this time, we would not have it in the bill, and we would be somewhere 2, 3, 5 weeks down the road still fighting. I might add, through the persuasion of my friend from Utah, we have 68 co-sponsors for that bill, so this ought to be something that is akin to motherhood. But it is critically important to deal with domestic violence and the absolute ravaging of women in this country as a consequence of being the victims of violent crime. So this is a very, very, very important amendment that we're about to vote on. And again, I thank my friend from Utah for his leadership, because make no mistake about it, we would not be doing this were he not willing to do the things he did to reach an accommodation on this bill. It's a pleasure working with him, and again, like I said, whenever we want to get something done, I have learned that it never hurts to go to the senator from West Virginia, and without exception, always helps. And I have no illusions, were it not for the senator from West Virginia and his legislative alchemy. He's the only man I know that can turn things from legislative dust into legislative gold. You have done that, Mr. Chairman. I compliment you for that. The entire Senate, and more importantly, and I mean this, it sounds like hyperbole, but the nation owes you a debt of gratitude for your ability to do those things which those of us who've only been around 20 years have still not learned how to do as well. And so,
Mr. President, the Senator yield.
I'd be happy to yield.
I thank him for the hyperbole.
That's right.
I appreciate it very much.
Well, it happens to be true, because I have, in my experience, been on the other side of a few, very few, other side of a few issues with my distinguished chairman of the Appropriations Committee, and I have always found it a less than rewarding experience. There's only one other person in my 20 years that I have been almost as mournful of not being with him when I've been against him, and that was Senator Russell Long. Russell Long was the only other man that whenever I stood up on the floor to take him on, by the time he got finished speaking, I felt so good and warm. I felt like calling my mother to tell her how I had done such a great thing, only to find when it was all over I had lost. So I have learned, but I truly do, Mr. Leader. I thank you. And again, this is a highly unusual thing to do, but John Hilley of the Majority Leader's staff came to me 3 weeks ago with this idea. I think this is one of those cases where there is not, in my view, enough money we could pay such a talented person to get something done. So I thank everyone for this, and hopefully once we pass this amendment, we can move rapidly through the remainder of this bill and present the American people with a very serious piece of legislation to deal with violence in America. I yield the floor.
Senator from New Mexico, I believe. Senator.
You are absolutely incredible.
But I tell you what,
Utah.
I appreciated the comments of the distinguished senator from Delaware, but I would like the distinguished senator from Delaware to listen to what I'm about to say. Let me just go on to another couple of matters. If you could listen to what I'm about to say.
I'm sorry.
In our zeal to get this done, and it really is a good package, it's something that everybody in this floor, both Democrats and Republicans, can feel good about. Because here we're providing for $8.9 billion for police. Every Republican ought to be for that. Every Democrat ought to be for that. I mean, it makes sense. If we want to do away with violent crime, let's get the police out there on the streets. And people on both sides have argued for this, but nobody more eloquently than the distinguished senator from Delaware. $3 billion for regional prisons, very badly needed. I think everybody on both sides of the floor can be happy about that. $3 billion for boot camps and operational grants to the states. This is a real chance for us to help the states and do something on crime. $500 million for juvenile detention facilities for the hardcore juvenile criminals. Something that just had to be done. But there is one problem in our zeal to get this done, and nobody is stronger for the Violence Against Women bill than I. I didn't realize that I was to protect the rights of the distinguished minority leader of the Senate and the distinguished senator from South Carolina. And in our zeal to put this in, we have not protected their rights. They wanted it to be brought up separately. And I feel very, very badly about that, because I would never have done that for anything in this world. I've asked the distinguished chairman of the Appropriations Committee if we could vitiate the unanimous consent agreement so that we could at least have that be separately debated so that Senators Dole and Helms would be able to bring up whatever they want to. Because the unanimous consent agreement prevents any first-degree amendments. And I'm very concerned about it because I want to get that bill passed. And I know the distinguished senator from Delaware does too, but I also don't want to trample on the rights of my esteemed colleagues. And I know that they have many rights that they can exercise on this matter anyway. So I hope that as we discuss this, we'll consider maybe recognizing those desires and my failure as floor manager to protect their rights. I didn't realize that I was supposed to, and it was my fault that I didn't realize, but I didn't. And it's certainly not the fault of the distinguished senator from Delaware, and it's certainly not the fault of our esteemed colleague, our great colleague from West Virginia, without whom we couldn't have put this together. Everybody here has to acknowledge that. But it would not be fair under these circumstances to foreclose the rights of our minority leader.
Well, Senator Yield, for just a moment.
Yeah.
I hope the senator will not exercise that unanimous consent request yet and give me an opportunity to meet with the senator from South Carolina and the senator from Kansas to determine North Carolina and the senator from Kansas to determine whether or not there's a way we cannot accommodate that, because I'm not...
See what can be done, okay?
I want to get you golf ship.
Mr. President, I know that Senator Domenici was next. Mr. President, let me yield the floor so that Senator Domenici and Senator Thurman can say what they'd like to say.
Senator from New Mexico.
Mr. President, I won't take a lot of time. I have a few questions I want to ask the distinguished chairman of the Appropriations Committee. Hopefully when we're through with a colloquy here and a few other observations that I have, I'm probably going to join as a co-sponsor. But it does seem to me that there are a couple of things we ought to clarify and get some explanations of, and I understand the chairman is willing to do that. So, Mr. President, let me start by saying that to some extent I share the concerns that were expressed this afternoon by the distinguished senator, senior senator from Oregon, Mr. Hatfield, about creating a new off-budget trust fund. I'm totally convinced and in accord with those who contend here on the floor that violent crime prevention is a very high priority for the people of our country and for the use of our resources. I can see other priority needs, however, that are already here and that would arise from time to time in the next 5 years or 6 that is encompassed by this amendment. The unified budget concept with everything on budget and as few trust funds as possible, and even some of those trust funds within the budget, this gives us a complete picture of the federal spending versus needs. So I had some reservations early on about establishing this funding mechanism. I know that the distinguished chairman shares some of these concerns. I would appreciate any response or ideas that he might have, that is the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, about the concerns I've just expressed.
Mr. President, if the distinguished senator will yield.
I'd be pleased to yield.
I may respond without losing his right to the floor. I understand the concerns expressed by Senator Hatfield and Senator Domenici regarding the establishment of a trust fund that would be created under this amendment. However, over the past weeks, I have had discussions with the distinguished chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Senator Biden. He has, upon numerous occasions, mentioned to me on this floor and elsewhere that he wanted to visit with me about the crime bill and about the funding of it. And he has spoken eloquently today, as have others, concerning the importance of this legislation. These discussions centered around whether we can find a way and how it could be found to assure that the programs authorized in this bill are funded. My response to them was that one approach that could be considered would be declaring a congressional and presidential emergency each year. But it would have to be done every year, in 5 years, for the appropriations that would be made pursuant with this act. And that would require, as we all know, that both the President and the Congress agree to spending under this act as an emergency. And I would note that this emergency designation, even if approved by the President and the Congress, would increase the deficit each year. Another method would be to rescind discretionary appropriations and apply the savings from those rescissions to offset the appropriations that would be necessary to fund programs such as those authorized in this act. But even then, I'm not at all sure that we could find those rescissions and that they would be enacted by both houses. It would also leave uncertain on a year-by-year basis how much, if any, of the authorizations contained in this act could be funded. The amount to be funded if rescissions were required would not be known until rescissions were enacted each year sufficient to pay for part or all of the programs authorized in this act. Other appropriations could have included making mandatory appropriations in the act itself and providing its appropriations in advance in the act. I don't like that approach. These appropriations would have been subject to a point of order in the Budget Act as well. While I share the legitimate concerns expressed by Senator Hatfield and Senator Domenici, I do have concerns. I determined that the establishment of the Violent Crime Reduction Trust Fund was the least offensive of these various approaches, and the approach that did the least damage to the existing budget and appropriations processes. Let me add further that I would prefer not to have to set aside or reserve the funds contained in this act at all. I don't like that way of proceeding. But I consider the crime problem to be a major crisis in this country that is getting worse and worse every day. And it is a crisis that demands that the spending provided in this act matches the rhetoric.
I thank the distinguished chairman for his comments, and I would ask another question. I had a concern the other day when Senator Graham offered his amendment, which mandated the caps on federal employees and built into law the number of full-time employee reductions recommended by the President's review of the government. I didn't vote for it then. I said to my friend, the chairman, after the vote that I didn't vote for it because I had no idea where the cuts would come from.
Yes, I came to the senator and I said, why did you vote against that amendment?
Right.
And
we didn't collaborate, but afterwards we talked.
Afterwards, I wondered why he voted against it. I had voted against it. And his answer made me feel all the more that on that occasion I was right.
So I remain concerned that the amendment which you originally offered would leave it up to the OMB to determine where the cuts within the federal employee and bureaucracy of our nation, where they would occur. And I was worried under the original amendment that you offered today that would be left totally up to the OMB director. Now, I understand, and I hope I'm correct, that the distinguished chairman has modified the amendment, and that the amendment which is at the desk now solves that concern, because the amendment will require that the President include an analysis of his proposed FTE reductions as part of the budget submission each year?
Mr. President, if the distinguished senator will yield, I know he intends for me to respond. If he'll yield without losing his right to the floor. The senator from New Mexico has described his concerns to me as recently as 2 hours ago and earlier. I have incorporated this language into the modification of the amendment. I appreciate his bringing this matter to my attention. I do believe that it is an improvement to the bill.
I thank the senator, and then I want to make one more point. I'm sure the senator agrees with me, the distinguished chairman agrees with me, that the pending amendment violates Section 306 of the Congressional Budget Act, which prohibits consideration of legislation under the jurisdiction of the Budget Committee that has not been reported by the Budget Committee. The Section 306 point of order can only be waived by an affirmative vote of 60 senators. I would inquire of the chair, is that a correct assessment of the situation?
It's correct, in the opinion of the chair.
I thank the chair, and I want to be clear that a 60-vote point of order lies against the pending amendment, and any future legislation creating an off-budget trust fund would also be subject to the same point of order. Am I correct on that?
Since this issue is not presently before the Senate, the chair would decline to rule on that matter at this point.
I thank the chair, but I would make the point for the Senate that I think it's important senators know that we're not going to turn the budget of the United States and the appropriation process into a myriad of trust accounts where we predetermine what the subcommittees of the Appropriations Committee will spend money on. I think my good friend from West Virginia would concur that that's not the intention, and that clearly if a very similar proposal for a similar trust fund with similar effect on the appropriation process and the budget itself is brought before the Senate, that we're not waiving that point of order if we choose to waive the point of order here tonight. I wonder if my friend from West Virginia would concur.
I do concur, and I thank the chair as well. I want to be clear that a 60-vote point of order does lie against the pending amendment. The distinguished senator from New Mexico and I discussed this earlier today, and we both agreed that it did, that it would lie. And any future legislation creating a I'll call it an off-budget trust fund, would also be subject to the same point of order, in my opinion. And may I say to the senator that I will just as zealously guard the legislative process in the future as I have in the past. It was only because of the very extenuating circumstances today that I think cry out for a solution throughout this country that I have taken this approach. And I thank the senator from New Mexico for being equally zealous and protecting of the budget process. This, in a sense, may be something of a precedent, but it won't count as a precedent that we have to follow in the future. I believe that any future legislation to expand the size of this trust fund or the programs eligible to be funded by this trust fund also would be subject to a 60-vote Budget Act point of order.
I thank the chairman. Mr. President, let me just take one more minute. I would like to ask the parliamentarian if he could rule on this, and if he can't, I understand. But if we do not vote on waiving the Budget Act on this amendment this evening, because nobody chooses to raise it, the senator from New Mexico doesn't raise it, do we in any way set a precedent that we can do this without waiving the point of order?
Mr. President,
or will failure to vote on it be construed to be a waiver?
Mr. President, I know the chair will respond. Before the chair responds, may I
Surely.
say a word on it?
Absolutely.
The chair cannot rule on this because no point of order has been made. Consequently, he cannot issue a ruling. The chair can respond to a parliamentary inquiry from the distinguished senator from New Mexico, and while that response to a parliamentary inquiry does not carry the weight of a ruling, at least it does sometimes provide guidance for both the chair and the Senate.
I thank the senator, and I apologize to the chair and the senators for not having raised my inquiry by way of a parliamentary inquiry. I should have done that. I thought I did that without stating the words, but I believe the chairman is stating that properly. So if you would convert my language to it being a parliamentary inquiry as to whether or not anything is waived if we proceed without a vote.
In the opinion of the chair, if a point of order is not raised today and the issue is not joined, the issue remains an open question.
Mr. President, I want to ask unanimous consent that I be added as an original co-sponsor and thank the distinguished chairman of the Appropriations Committee for the work that he's done and all others who have put this together. I think it's historic, and from my standpoint, as the money is saved from reducing the workforce of the United States, I thought maybe we would salvage some of it for deficit reduction. But as I looked at things, I was quite sure we would lose that battle and it would be spent. And as a consequence, I join in saying if we are going to spend it, we probably ought to spend it for the most serious domestic issue in our country. Exactly. I yield the floor.
Without objection, the senator from New Mexico will be added as a co-sponsor. Senator from South Carolina is recognized.
Mr. President, I rise in support of the pending amendment on prisons, which has been worked out by the chairman and ranking member of the Judiciary Committee with the able assistance of Senator Byrd, our President pro tempore. Without doubt, there is a critical need for additional prison spaces across the nation. According to the Department of Justice, there are more men and women in state and federal prisons than ever before. The Bureau of Justice Statistics reports that the inmate population on June the 30th, 1993 was 925,247. A number of states have parole systems that release prisoners before they have served their full sentences. Other states have early release programs, either on their own or pursuant to court orders, that are specifically designed to keep down their prison populations. As a result, crimes are being committed by prisoners released early that would not have been committed if the prisoners had remained in prison for the duration of their sentence. Mr. President, it does little to arrest, prosecute, and convict violent offenders, only to see them prematurely released because of prison overcrowding. As Georgia's Democrat Attorney General Michael Bauer stated, and I quote, "All of the police officers in the world are not going to make a difference on the crime situation until you provide a place to put the criminals. Unless you do that, this is a waste of time," end quote. Mr. President, adequate prison space is a critical link in the state criminal justice system. We must address the problem of early release of violent offenders due to a lack of prison space. I am pleased that we have been able to reach agreement with our Democratic colleagues to provide badly needed funding for regional and state prisons. A vital provision within this compromise will encourage states to adopt greater truth in sentencing laws to ensure that violent offenders serve their time. When law enforcement does its work arresting violent offenders, it will ultimately make little impact on crime if we have so little prison space that convicted offenders are put back on the street well before they have completed their sentences. This amendment will help the states close the revolving prison door for violent offenders. This compromise will provide $6 billion for construction, maintenance, and operation of regional and state prisons and jails. Additionally, this funding will incorporate the distinguished chairman's proposal on boot camps and other alternative sanctions. Further, we have reached agreement on funding for putting more police officers, more police on the street to continue the fight against the violent predators. I wish to commend the chairman and ranking member for their bipartisan efforts on this amendment. With this type of cooperation, we should soon be able to complete action on the comprehensive crime bill and meet our responsibility to the American people. I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment. I yield the floor, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from North Dakota.
Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that I be allowed to join on the pending Byrd amendment as an original co-sponsor.
Is there objection? Hearing none, so ordered.
Mr. President, maybe I could be permitted to just make a brief comment and to thank the President Pro Tem and the Chairman of the Appropriations Committee for what he has proposed in this amendment. Mr. President, if I might just say that earlier today I had been prepared to offer an amendment to offer a substantial increase for prison construction so that we might assure the American people that the most violent repeat offenders would have to serve 85% of their sentence and that we would have the facilities to allow that to happen. Mr. President, I am extremely pleased that in this Byrd amendment that truth in sentencing provision is included, that the money to make certain that we have the facilities to house those prisoners is included, and that in addition, another amendment that I was prepared to offer after having worked closely with the Judiciary Committee over a number of days to provide secure facilities for violent juveniles. And we were talking about a funding level of $100 million or $200 million. In the Byrd amendment, that has been raised to $600 million. Mr. President, I believe that is going to make a difference in this country, a difference for the better, something that is desperately needed, both in terms of violent juveniles and in terms of those who are violent repeat offenders. Mr. President, this is a leap forward from where we started the day. And I think all those involved, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Senator Biden, the ranking member, Senator Hatch, and the chairman of the Appropriations Committee are to be publicly commended and thanked for their excellent work. I also, Mr. President, would like to take a moment to salute my colleague from Massachusetts, Senator Kerry, who so aggressively has pursued additional funding so that this crime bill would really make a difference in the lives of people, so that it would not just be a cosmetic bill, so it would be a bill that would actually make a difference in people's lives. I've been in meeting after meeting, hour after hour with the senator from Massachusetts in which he made very clear how much he wanted to see 100,000 additional police, and not done in some cosmetic way, not done in some clever way that made a good press release, but in some way that actually delivered on the promise. Mr. President, I believe this amendment goes a long way towards doing that, and I want to again publicly thank all those who have been involved. I yield the floor.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Mr. President, I begin by thanking my friend from North Dakota. And if you're ever in one of these fights where you're looking for this place to do something real, you want to have the senator from North Dakota with you in that effort. He has pushed this as hard as anybody, and I'm very appreciative for his comments and especially for his support. I would like to, I came to the floor earlier today, and I've been pushing a number of different people over the course of the last weeks. And I would like to say that this, what we are about to do, if indeed we are, and I hope we are, is real, and it is
very significant. This is such a quantum leap from where we were a few hours ago, and certainly from where we were just a week ago, that you really kind of have to pinch yourself. And the person who's provided this incredible coup is indeed the President Pro Tem and the distinguished Chairman of the Appropriations Committee. I think all of us understand that if he didn't believe this ought to happen, and if he didn't believe there was a way to make it happen, this would not be happening. And I think that it's a tribute to the way that he listens, I might say. I know when I went to visit him a week ago, there's much that he has on his mind, but as he always does, he meets with junior members who ask for a meeting. And I knew that even though he told me that he didn't quite know how we could do this, but I knew from his look and from the time he gave me and the concern he expressed that if there was a way, the senator from West Virginia was going to try to find it because he understood. And I think that he deserves just enormous credit for this, because this is really, in all the years that I've been here, the most real and significant response to what is a very complex and often contentious and sometimes too partisan effort to try to deliver something real to the American people. And today, presuming we move forward in these next moments, and I presume that, we have broken down that partisanship, and we are about to take a step which is an enormous down payment on protecting and providing for the domestic tranquility and security of this country. So I really do salute the distinguished President Pro Tem. I also want to say that Senator Hatch and I met this morning, sort of by happenstance, on the Fox Morning Network, where we both had opposing views on this bill, and we expressed them. And at the end of that, we had a conversation that lasted about 20 minutes, half an hour, in which we sort of unraveled the differences but found the common ground, and both expressed a sense that we might be able to find something that was a legitimate and important compromise in the course of this bill. I never anticipated it would happen in the same afternoon after that conversation, but thanks to the seriousness of purpose, which has been really, I think, catalyzed by the senator from West Virginia, all parties have come together and we're poised to do something that is not insignificant by any sense of the word. I also want to say that as good as this is, and I don't want to be the skunk at the picnic, there is more to be done. There are schools yet to be kept open. There are kids who are still going to need programs. There's an enormous amount to make up for. But this is a real step. This is not cosmetic. This is not rhetorical. This is not something that is press release oriented. And this will, if we follow through on it through the appropriations process, as I think that the distinguished President Pro Tem has guaranteed through the structure of it, this is going to make a difference. And I really thank him, and I thank the distinguished senator from Delaware and Senator Hatch for helping to get us to this moment.
Mr. President, the distinguished senator yield.
I would yield.
Mr. President, I thank the distinguished senator for his extremely charitable and gracious words. I thank him even more so for